Hello, my name is Pat Kirschlin. We're here tonight with Lyndon LaRouche, the presidential candidate of the U.S. Labor Party. Good evening.
Good evening.
You said after the last presidential debate that if you had been there, you could have won the debate, you could have won the election hands down in a single night. What are the issues that you could address that were ignored or basically ignored by Carter and Ford?
Well, there are two fundamental issues facing the nation and actually the world at this time, neither of which was directly addressed during the debate and have not been addressed in terms that the average voter would understand by most of the national media. First, we are now in greater danger of thermonuclear war than we've ever been in our nation's history. 1962 missile crisis was a near miss, though I think sometimes in looking back people thought it was closer than it actually was at that point. But since the summer of 1973, we've been edging closer and closer to thermonuclear war. Now, Ford in the past has referred to this during the primary campaign. Ronald Reagan made an impassioned statement concerning the war danger at the close of the Republican convention. But the average American voter knows nothing of what the issues are. He simply hears talk about military policy, defense policy, and so forth. Doesn't know what's going on. And it's a vital issue before the nation. We could be at thermonuclear war next week if someone in Washington or Moscow were to be stupid. That's the nature of the situation. And it will become increasingly acute up through next summer unless something is done to change the world situation in the meantime. Secondly, right at this particular point, the post-war international monetary system is in the process of collapse. It's going to collapse during this quarter. What the form of collapse will be will depend upon what various people do. But it's now in the process of collapse. A collapse means either we get a new monetary system in place or we have a depression which makes the 1930s look very tame indeed. Neither of these issues were presented by the candidates, neither were discussed by the candidates, and unfortunately, in addition to the candidates' failure, our national media have so far failed to educate the average American voter on what these issues are or what the facts are concerning them.
Okay, why nuclear war, and how are the two issues related?
Well, during the post-war period, particularly since Truman fired General MacArthur, it's been understood that the Soviet Union had a thermonuclear capability and that war could be avoided on two conditions. Number one, that neither the Soviet-led forces nor NATO, US-led forces, would interfere in the countries which are directly members of these two military pacts. That is, the United States would not intervene in Eastern Europe. The Soviets and Eastern Europeans would not intervene in the internal affairs or attempt to take over any of the NATO countries. It was also understood that the developing sector represented an area of conflict, and this perception increased of this problem over a period of years, and that the United States and the Soviet Union would be very careful to negotiate at crucial points to prevent some situation in the developing sector from becoming a trigger into escalation into thermonuclear war. Now, at present, because of the collapse of the monetary system, which means anywhere upwards of $3 trillion worth of paper is now in jeopardy because of the monetary situation. Some forces within New York-centered forces, to use a simple term, are determined to try to save this structure, this financial structure, by imposing upon the advanced sector and also the developing sector a stringent form of austerity modeled on the policies of Hjalmar Schacht in the Nazi regime. Slightly different than Schacht's, but essentially modeled the same approach. This would mean the kind of austerity imposed upon the developing sector as a way of trying to extract debt payment from them, which could not be imposed even by a police state, such as the Chilean type. That it's impossible to get in the developing sector any even narrow social base to support a dictatorship which would maintain that kind of genocidal austerity upon its own population. Therefore, and everyone who's involved in this knows it, at least those who are thinking clearly, that this would mean imposing a NATO political military rule over most of the developing sector. Now, what that means is a shift in the strategic correlation of forces globally to the point that the Soviets would not stand it, which would mean that the Soviets at some point in that process, some issue would not back down, but would go to thermonuclear war. The Middle East conflict is one of the triggers that might set such a war off. So that this issue of the developing sector issue, the attempt to impose this kind of Shaktian austerity on the developing sector, which is Kissinger's policy, it's Carter's policy. Ford has vacillated between supporting and not supporting Kissinger's policy. But that's where the danger arises.
Okay, how would you, given this situation, obviously a very serious one, how would you propose, if you yourself were president, or propose to someone like Ford, who you said there's some hope for, how would you propose that they deal with that situation? What kinds of policies could undercut this problem?
Well, obviously, there is no issue between the Soviet bloc and the NATO countries as nations which would warrant a thermonuclear war. It's only this monetary crisis which brings us into this fix. So therefore, if we get a new monetary system, we not only obviate the danger of general depression, no depression need occur, but we also remove the world condition which would lead into thermonuclear war. And thus you could virtually write your own ticket in the White House on what degree of military disarmament agreements you wanted with the Soviet leadership. So that would be the solution. The basic form of the solution is essentially this. The OECD countries are bankrupt. The developing sector is bankrupt. But it needn't be a disaster. As in a corporate bankruptcy, when you have an essentially viable industry which has gotten itself into financial trouble, is bankrupt, you put it through bankruptcy reorganization, financial reorganization. You can do the same thing with the global economy. You simply take this mass of unpayable paper, shove it to one side for future renegotiation, set up a new monetary system to create credit to keep basic production and agriculture and industry going. Now we can, at this point, we can have, that is, anyone in the White House who wants it, can have a new international monetary system which would establish approximately $300 billion a year of long-term credit principally for exports of industrial commodities from the advanced sector to the developing sector, of which the United States share would be approximately $100 billion a year. This would get us out of the depression, would get the world out of the depression, and would provide a stable monetary system and a long-term perspective for growth. Without such a measure, there's no hope for avoiding the depression, and I think very little hope for avoiding war.
Okay, you mentioned before you defined New York forces as being the people who would be interested in maintaining this present economic structure, and as a result are the ones who are pushing towards the kind of policies that would create such a nuclear war danger.
Well, I go back, there's a history to this. At the time of the Versailles Treaty, there was a fundamental disagreement among the Allies. One faction said, do not impose massive war reparations on Germany, because if you do, then Germany, which is an industrial country, cannot pay large reparations. Germany will not recover industrially, and this procedure will mean a permanent collapse of the industrial or world economy. As a matter of fact, one of the better papers that Lord Keynes did was on the peace of Versailles, in which he emphasized that the Allies had lost the peace at Versailles by virtue of imposing this war reparation structure on defeated Germany. As a result of that, the Versailles Treaty, the France, Great Britain, the United States began to build up a massive monetary structure, which we've managed to roll over despite the Depression, at least in large measure, this date. So there are forces associated with New York bankers, which are generally identified primarily with Rockefeller-led interests, Rockefeller family-dominated interests, which are committed to maintaining this debt structure, which is a heritage of the First World War, the Versailles Treaty. They have become dominant in shaping international policy, in shaping the policies or dominating the policies of the United States government. They are associated with a policy developed during the 1930s, late 1930s, called the American Century Doctrine. They see that a financial reorganization of the monetary system as meaning a loss of their financial and political hegemony in the world. They are not prepared to accept the loss of their dominance or dominating influence in the world. Other forces, such as the Chicago Center forces, Southwestern interests, Texas interests, Italian industrial interests, French industrial interests, a large segment of West German industrial interests, Belgian interests, and increasingly now in the past week or so, British interests, are perfectly prepared to put the so-called capitalist sector through financial reorganization and to accept something like the International Development Bank, which I've proposed, as you know. The Rockefellers and their people, Kissinger, the Carter backers, are not prepared to accept that and are willing to go to the brink of thermonuclear war to avoid that kind of thing.
How would this new monetary system, with the extension of credits, the expansion, and the development and maintenance of production and actual industrial production, benefit the United States? You've obviously pointed out that it would have the obvious benefit of preventing a thermonuclear war. But beyond that, in terms of the economic situation, how will this create a situation that will be to the benefit of the United States? What will come out of this?
All right, we have in the developing sector a capability in terms of well-defined projects, that is, projects which are not sinkholes, projects which will pay off. Agricultural development, industrial center development, urban development, and infrastructure development. We have a capability of putting into the developing sector upwards of $500 billion a year. That's the world's capability. This involves massive agricultural development in the subcontinent of Asia. We can turn the Rio de la Plata region in South America, that's northern Argentina, southern Brazil, and Uruguay, turn it into one of the great agricultural and industrial areas of the world in terms of production. All it requires is tractors, fertilizers, and so forth. The Sahel, which is now a plague center, a center of hunger and disease, could over a 15-20-year period not only in the short term be brought out of its present misery, but can become the great breadbasket for all of Africa. In addition, India, for example. India, while it's a poor country on the one hand in terms of its agriculture, India has the third largest population of scientists and engineers in the world, a great industrial potential, as well as the means for developing its agriculture. Bengal, a country which is on the brink of breakdown, could become one of the great breadbaskets of the world. So, of this, and I estimate that about $300 billion a year could be negotiated at this time, because the willingness is there. Of this, the United States would get about $100 billion. Now, that would go into a number of things. For example, it would involve increasing U.S. tractor output from about 800,000 to 1 million units a year, which is our present output capacity, to about 4 to 5 million units a year. This would require converting large sections of idle automobile industry. It would require a vast increase in our steel production. Now, we can double the steel output of the United States, almost with existing capacity, with retooling and some augmentation, through using the Jordan steel process and other processes. Our fertilizer capital goods producing capacity, our agricultural technology capacity, this is where the $100 billion would go. The byproduct of increasing world export to the developing sector by $300 billion for this kind of work would mean that you would get a secondary growth in industrial requirements, a growth in world trade, which would mean we'd be into the largest industrial boom in modern history. And this is exactly where we have the getting out of this depression, getting to that kind of boom. We then have the material conditions and the prosperity with which to attack the other kinds of material problems, the social problems which we're not able to solve at this time.
Okay, how does your program this is a program for full employment, certainly, full maximum use of the industrial capability of this country, which has been largely stagnated and underused, and certainly the technology that exists potentially has not been used. How does your program of full production full employment differ from the Democratic Party's platform, which Jimmy Carter is running on? They're making a big deal of the fact that the that we're far from full employment now, and they could provide full employment.
Well, of course, what Jimmy Carter says shouldn't be taken too seriously, because his advisors have the problem of getting him to repeat with reasonable accuracy what's out of one side of his head, what's poured in the other side. But if you refer to his backers, people like Cyrus Vance, people from the Brookings Institutions, Zbigniew Brzezinski, George Ball, etc., etc., they have a policy. Their policy is essentially that I referred to. It's the Rockefeller policy. It's a policy developed largely by the Brookings Institution, though other people have been involved in it, which is based on their perception of the successful aspects of the Hitler regime of the 1933-1936 period. For example, the Democratic Party is committed to a bill called the Humphrey-Hawkins Bill. The Humphrey-Hawkins Bill is consciously modeled on the Nazi labor service legislation introduced during the period 1933 to 1936. What, in general, the employment perspectives of the Democratic platform are to create not productive jobs, but to create low-wage, labor-intensive, leaf-raking jobs or make-work jobs as a substitute for unemployment, compensation, and welfare. That's the basic thrust. It's a program which aims at deindustrializing the United States. They propose to strip the Middle West, or industrial Middle West, of its basic industry. They propose to strip New England of its electronics and related industries, that sort of thing, to return the United States to what they see as a lower energy requiring, more primitive condition with less emphasis on technology. Such a program could only result in genocide in this country and others. Our ability to maintain our environment, our ability to meet our needs, depends upon increasing technology, increasing the application of technology in industry and in agriculture. The Republican platform, in contrast to the Democrats, shows what the difference is. The Republicans, though they have no program to solve the problems, have an approach which is the traditional American approach. They're committed to technological development, to industrial development, and to agricultural development as the way of providing jobs. The Democrats are, at least as far as the program is concerned and Carter's backers are concerned, though I think the average Democrat in this country thinks differently, is committed to de-emphasizing industry, de-emphasizing agricultural development, de-emphasizing technology, using labor-intensive, low-wage employment, and essentially the same formula that the Hitler regime did during the 33-36 period.
Okay, you emphasized very strongly that the United States is in a very serious situation with the threat of economic collapse and nuclear war. How do we get from that point, the point we're at now, to the kinds of I think, very, very desirable solutions that you've outlined?
We have two ways we can get it. If I were president, no problem. That the work we've done with the developing sector, the work we've done directly with political factions and governments abroad in Europe and so forth, the degree to which we've touched base with political forces, industrialists, and financial forces in this country.
By we, you mean the U.S.
Labor Party and some, particularly my own work and that of my close associates who've been in on this. We have established acceptance for the International Development Bank as an alternative. Now, among these forces, some people are supporting it, pushing it. Others have indicated they would support it if it were offered, as opposed to pushing for it. So if I'm in the White House, no problem. The preponderance of nations would immediately participate on the recommendation of the White House to establish a new monetary system. We've determined recently that the Comecon, the Soviets and others, would accept such an alternative if offered by the United States and other nations. It's no problem. The alternative then is, could either of the other two candidates, major party candidates, handle it, such as Carter or Ford? Well, Carter's out. There's no chance for the United States with Carter in. There's a question mark on Ford. If Ford were to return to the fold of mainstream Republicans, a fold which he has abandoned essentially since the convention, and to go by their instincts, I think that these people, together with most forces associated with the traditional Democrats will accept the International Development Bank proposal and things like it, at least a minimal amount of it, of our program. So that it's possible, provided that Ford is forced to dump Kissinger, to dump Levy, to dump Simon's policies, and so forth, and get back with the mainstream Republicans and with Democrats like Adlai Stevenson and people like that. If Ford goes with them, then I think the United States would pick up at least the most essential features of the policies that I would introduce, and we would at least survive. We might not have a good result, but we would be safe, and we would be coming out of the Depression, and we could fight it out from there.
Okay, in order to have someone like Ford is the obvious person in line for this, to move to support in one form or another the proposals you've outlined, and certainly in order to get you elected, would require a considerable mobilization of public opinion and support around your campaign. What kind of support do you have around the country? What kind of a machine does the Labor Party have?
We have enough support now that under certain conditions we could get up to 30% of the vote. We have a potential which runs about 33-35%. That's a sociologically determined political potential for the Labor Party. But we could get up to 30% at this point. Now, it means between 10% and 30% in urban industrial areas in which we're running. The problem with the American voter is that he has not yet learned to act entirely upon his own instinct and his own intelligence. He tends to adapt himself somewhat to what he thinks is possible, not to fighting to make possible what he thinks he should have. And I would say the crucial thing at this time, which would be essential to make the campaign effective, that is to make it realize its potential, would be television advertising or television coverage. That if the voter sees, and that relates to your first question, if the voter has a chance to see what we have to present in the same medium that he sees Carter and Ford, then seeing it on an authoritative medium will cause him to respond to what his preference is. Whereas if he doesn't see the campaign on his medium, on the TV, the voter is going to stay away from the polls, particularly our voters, and which means we would converge down toward the 10% expectation. But if the matching funds thing is cleared, which means we'll use that mainly for television advertising, 5-minute spots, that sort of thing, then I think we have a real shot to bring forward our potential vote. And at the same time, by the impact of our vote in the election, to contribute to the shaping of the policies that anyone will have to follow in this period.
Okay, you are a Marxist, contributed considerably theoretically to the subject of Marxian economics, etc. And you're proposing a program which is basically one that would put a capitalist economy, capitalist industrialist economy on its feet. Is there any dichotomy between those two, and how would you respond to a voter who's very interested in the kinds of proposals you're making, but has thoughts about what it means for a socialist or a Marxist to be president?
Well, as you know, as this situation developed, my attention turned frequently to the role of Karl Marx during the early 1960s. In the case of the 1860s, in the case of the American Civil War, in which Marx and associates in the United States, such as Wedemeyer and others, were among the leaders in the Republican Party at that point, or the Republican Party's effort at that point, to save the Union, to save the United States from being shattered into a collection of nations ruled essentially by England. We're in the same boat today, in large measure. The socialist movement as an organized political movement with clear ideas, clear programs in the Western Europe, in the United States, in Japan is a bad joke. The only socialist movement of any significance, there are a few exceptions in Europe, but the only socialist organization of any significance is the National Caucus of Labor Committees in the advanced capitalist sector.
And that is the affiliate of the U.S. Labor Party.
Now, which means that there is no population which is significantly mobilized to consider socialist alternatives at this time as a practical measure. All right, we have a crisis. If something isn't done about this crisis, if satisfactory solutions are not developed, then we go down the drain. All right, so if a socialist solution is not possible, then only a capitalist solution is possible. Therefore, it is my responsibility to make possible a capitalist solution, not because I'm pro-capitalist, but because that's the only thing that can be done at this point politically to ensure the human race's survival from these monstrous things which otherwise face us. And therefore, I'm in the same position as Karl Marx was. That Lincoln has to be saved. Lincoln has to be backed up. The Civil War has to be won.
Okay, and how do you... Okay, we've run out of time now. We've been speaking with Lyndon LaRouche, the presidential candidate of the U.S. Labor Party, who is on the ballot now in 25 states and is running, as I said, for President of the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you.